Hi, thank you for joining us. I'm Jeremy Pittman with the Grassroots Engagement Team at EDF Action, the advocacy partner of the Environmental Defense Fund. I'm excited to continue our conversations about climate at a crossroads, picking up on our 2025 preview earlier this year and our special event with former Environmental Protection Agency Director Gina McCarthy a few months back. Unfortunately, the news from Washington is not good. Before we get to that, though, thanks to everyone who submitted questions in advance for tonight's program. And if you have questions during the event, please write them in the comments section wherever you're watching. We're going to try to answer as many of your questions as we can. If you, like me, care about the human impacts of our changing climate, it's been a tough year. In the first 6 months of the year, we've seen $12 billion extreme weather events in the United States, including the devastating wildfires in Los Angeles. And even with that backdrop, President Trump and Republican leaders in Congress have been taking us backwards on climate and clean energy. I'm thrilled to be joined tonight by a couple of amazing EDF experts, Emily Wurzbach and Noha Hagag. We'll be in conversation in just a bit, but first, I want to set the stage for our conversations with a high-level look at what we've seen in Washington so far this year. When we started the year, we anticipated that President Trump would follow the Project 2025 playbook and really engage in three major lines of attack. And no surprise, that is exactly what we've seen. First, there's an attempt to eliminate investments in clean energy and transportation and add new giveaways to fossil fuel polluters. Next, we're looking at rollbacks of protections against health-harming pollution. And finally, the administration is working to cut critical staff and budgets. So where do we stand on each of these lines of attack? On the attacks against investments in clean energy and transportation, unfortunately, that is a completed mark. President Trump signed into law on July 4th the tax bill that eliminates significantly the investments in clean energy and transportation. In terms of the rollbacks of protections against health-harming pollution, those attacks are in process. And finally, in terms of the cuts to critical staff and budgets, those are also in process. We'll talk more about each of them and get a little more depth as we get into our conversations. So as we look at the year and we look at each of these provisions, we're going to dive more deeply, but at the highest level, thinking about what happened when President Trump signed into law the tax and spending bill on the 4th of July. Well, that bill includes a lot of provisions related to everything from Medicaid to, well, yes, our issues that we care about here at Clean Energy and Climate. This bill, it ends the tax credits to build wind and solar projects. It ends tax credits to build EV charging stations. It ends the tax credits for consumers to buy electric vehicles and install charging equipment. It ends the tax credits for homeowners to install solar and upgrade to cleaner energy efficient appliances. And even worse somehow, it creates new tax credits for coal, and it creates a new 10-year delay in implementing a fee on oil and gas producers' wasted methane. So rolling back all of the clean energy and transportation provisions that we worked so hard to enact, and putting forward new fossil fuel giveaways. In terms of the rollbacks on the provisions of protections against health-harming pollution, there are significant rollbacks underway at the Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of Transportation, and the Department of Energy. And these are really harmful. These are all about air pollution from power plants and industrial sites, air pollution from cars, trucks, and buses, the ability for the Environmental Protection Agency to set standards for climate pollution, hazardous waste and water pollution from power plants and industrial sites, and even energy efficiency standards for home appliances. They're coming at everything, and they're coming hard. And then as we look at the cuts to our critical staff and budgets, staff cuts at federal agencies have included layoffs, employee buyouts, and hiring freezes Been lots of headlines about this. Well, what we've seen are hundreds laid off and more than 3,000 buyouts at the Environmental Protection Agency, including the elimination of the Office of Environmental Justice and just recently announced the elimination of the Office of Research and Development, which researches climate as well as toxic chemicals and drinking water pollutants. At the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, we've seen thousands laid off or taking the buyouts, including 600 at the National Weather Service. And less of a headline, but at least 1,200 employees have been laid off at the Department of Agriculture's Natural Resources Conservation Service, which is responsible for implementing climate-smart soil and water conservation projects. So tremendous cuts on the staffing side, and we're also seeing these cuts on the budget side. When we look at President Trump's proposed fiscal year 2026 budget, which would begin in October of this year, those budget cuts that he's calling for, more than 50% for the Environmental Protection Agency, a 27% budget cut requested for the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, a 74% cut proposed for the Department of Energy's Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy. And it gets the headlines, 38% proposed cut to the budgets at the National Park Service. We'll talk more about all of this in just a few minutes. And I think we're going to get into conversation here. I'm pleased to be in conversation. Well, first, a little bit of the timeline for action. We'll talk more about this as well. But what's next? We're currently in the moment where the Congress is budgeting for the next fiscal year that starts in October of 2025. So that's in process, and we'll talk about that. We're also seeing continued rollbacks of the protections that we have fought so hard to put in place, especially at the Environmental Protection Agency. We're going to have a great conversation with my colleague Noha about that. Next, also, there are some elections this year, in critical elections that will set the tone for the year to come, including governor's elections in Virginia and New Jersey. So lots of work to do to ensure that we elect champions in these key statewide races happening later this year. And then the big next opportunity to return some checks and balances to government, the 2026 midterm elections, where we could re-elect a new climate majority in the U.S. House of Representatives and make gains in the Senate as well. So incredible timeline for action over the next year as we look for what's next. And now I'm going to turn to conversation. We're going to be in conversation first with Emily Wurzba from our Federal Affairs team about the reconciliation bill, the President Trump's tax bill that was signed on the 4th of July, and all the harmful provisions in that. Emily, thank you for joining us. So glad to have you here. Really appreciate it. Emily, as we look at this, first, I'll get started with a question that came from one of our audience members in advance. David in Nevada asked the question. He says, we've been following this package for months, and we talked about what we could expect back in January at our kickoff event. How did the final bill stack up? What is the bill's overall impacts on our efforts to address climate change? Thank you, David, for asking the question. Emily?
Yeah, thank you, David, for the question, and thanks, Jeremy, for having me on tonight. Really excited to talk more about this legislation. So, unfortunately, you named it. The law includes many incredibly harmful provisions that are going to have a lot of bad impacts. It's going to raise household energy costs. It's going to destabilize our grid reliability at a time of increasingly extreme weather. It'll stifle new development and just continue to take choices away from American consumers. So it's a really, really bad bill. This law, it effectively guts the clean energy tax credits. And I know, Jeremy, you listed out some of the specifics, but one of the big things that we had focused on is that it ends solar and wind tax credits for projects that aren't placed in service or operating by the end of 2027. And it also adds a number of new restrictions before projects can even qualify. So we're really seeing, we went from having 10 years of certainty for these sorts of projects to only a couple of months left. And then in addition, as you mentioned, the largest polluting oil and gas companies are now going to receive a 10-year break from having to pay a fee on wasteful methane pollution. And this will cause a lot of harm to our climate and our public health. Our experts, we've seen that this delay will result in 640,000 metric tons more methane every year and cost the government $1 billion in lost revenue next year, all at the same time that it's causing damage to public health and safety as we're seeing the worst impacts of climate change across the country and everywhere. This bill, it claws back funding from a number of important programs that were cleaning up our air and advancing clean energy. I think, the bottom line is that this law is taking our country in the wrong direction at a time when families and communities are experiencing the impacts of climate change more than ever. And this bill only makes it harder for us to address those problems and to bring cleaner energy onto the grid.
Wow, that's a lot, and I know it's only half of the picture. Emily, what's the impact for consumers? Can families still get solar panels or purchase EVs and receive a tax credit? We know that the tax credits for building, big solar facilities are gone. What about at the household level?
Yeah, unfortunately, that's sort of one of the things that is most impacted in this legislation. So it really guts the energy and efficiency and transportation tax credits for consumers. So if you are hoping to get a new or used electric vehicle, those tax credits will go away after September 30th of this calendar year. So they're not going to be around for much longer. The residential solar tax credit and home improvement credits, those will be eliminated by the end of this calendar year after December 31st. And then the energy efficiency home credit will be gone after June 30th of next year. So I think, it's harmful that these specific credits are going away for consumers, but kind of consumers and households will also feel the impact of this broader package in a number of ways. So there's been all of these estimates about how the legislation will increase household electricity rates. There are projections that household energy prices will go up by 16% by 2030. So, it varies state by state, but some states will see up to $400 a year in increased costs in the next decade. So really, this will have a big impact on households. And this bill will also cost jobs. According to the Energy Innovation, workers will suffer 760,000 lost jobs by 2030. So, not only do we see prices increase for families, it's also costing jobs. So unfortunately, it's going to have a large impact.
Yeah, a big impact, and even other impacts by not addressing the climate issues. We're going to continue to see home insurance prices go up, and other impacts that cost families real money.
Yeah, that's definitely right.
Yeah. Well, this all sounds really terrible. Are there any programs that didn't see major cuts?
Yeah. So I think, there are a number of programs that were passed as part of the bipartisan infrastructure law that were not touched by this specific piece of legislation. So that's some of the funding that was passed 5 years ago for things like the Clean School Bus Program or EV charging infrastructure funding for the states. So there are a number of grant programs from that law that were not sort of impacted from reconciliation. However, some of those programs are facing other threats, but this bill didn't touch everything. And there were a number of provisions that were almost included in the legislation or had been part of the conversation that in the final law, they were not in the bill. So a couple examples that maybe you all have been paying attention to, things like regulatory reform to make it harder for agencies to put forward standards to protect public health. There was talk of including a fee on electric vehicles. That was not ultimately included in the bill. At the last minute, we avoided a new additional tax on wind and solar energy, which would have been even more harmful to the industry. Other things too that made the news were this attempt to sell off public lands that was also not included in the final version of the bill. So it's really bad, and there were additional provisions that I'm grateful were not included in the final bill.
Small silver linings at best, but What do you think are some of the impacts of this bill on communities? We've talked about, the sort of national impacts, and we've talked about the household impacts. What about communities? How are we going to see this play out?
Yeah, there's a few examples I can give. So, one thing you had flagged at the beginning of this call is that the law gives a new tax credit to coal. And as we know, coal pollution causes cancer and damages children's brains, and it's so much more expensive and less efficient to produce. And so, I think we're really, we could see increased health harms because of policies like that. The law also is eliminating the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, which was a $27 billion program that was supposed to help um, like local entities help reduce climate and air pollution all across the United States. So unfortunately, that has gone too. The law is also canceling grants that were specifically for upgrading air monitoring equipment and measuring air quality at schools. So, we're just seeing so many impacts on the ground. We will see across the country. One other thing, just to flag, since you mentioned the grants for National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration as part of this, the president's budget. This law that passed also is ending some of those grants through that agency that were to help protect and prepare coastlines and fisheries for extreme weather and improve weather forecasts and communications with the American people. So unfortunately, those programs were also rolled back as part of this law. So I think we're really seeing a lot of effects on communities directly.
Wow. So the law not only is going to make it so that we're not addressing some of the root causes of climate change, but also make it so that we're not going to be as prepared for the impacts that we're already seeing and are only going to be seeing more.
Unfortunately, yes.
A double whammy. This just is, as I said at the top, the news from Washington is not good, and I think that's sadly true. So Emily, we got a question from Leonard in Florida, who submitted in advance. Thank you, Leonard, who says that my U.S. representative and senators in Florida are 100% behind Trump's agenda. So how can I make any headway with them? Do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I get questions like that a lot, and there's a few things that I always think about. One, it can be so frustrating to feel like you have an elected official that's not representing your values, and I think it can be easy to feel like my voice doesn't matter. Why do I keep trying? But in my experience, it's so important to, even if your representative will disagree with you, to still contact them, to be in dialogue with them, to make phone calls to their office or send emails or try to meet with their staff. I think by continuing to make your voice heard, they can't ignore that, and they have to have at least a response. It's really easy if they never hear that anyone disagrees with them. It's really easy for them to just say, well, none of my constituents care about this, so I don't have to address it. But by continuing to speak to them, that they have to at least acknowledge that there's opposition. And then I'll also just say, by telling the story of how these issues are impacting your community, why you care about them, you never know the seeds that you're planting with a member of Congress. They're in a former position. I worked with an organizer for a whole year. She was meeting with her representative on a specific climate and resiliency provision, and she felt so frustrated because for this whole year, this member of Congress wasn't budging. And then a year later, he took a vote, and he voted in support of funding for this very thing that she'd spent a whole year advocating on. And I called her up, and I was so excited to tell her, because you never know sort of what difference that'll make. So it's definitely frustrating, but it's so important to keep raising your voice and telling that impact.
Thanks, Emily. That's I think a lot of people can take something from that and hopefully keep at it. And I think the reverse is true too. Like if you live in a congressional district where your member of Congress is good on our issues, it's also still important to be contacting them regularly and making sure that they are hearing from you and hearing how important this issue is to you as a constituent.
Absolutely. And the thank yous are so important. And so I keep it up for sure.
Yeah, we want champions to be stronger champions, and those who aren't with us yet to be with us tomorrow. So the work is really important. And thank you, Emily, for joining us. I think you're going to hang around for questions at the end if we get more questions in the chat. But now we're going to turn to that second line of attack that we've been facing, which is around the protections, the protective standards that exist through federal agencies. These include protections against pollution from power plants, industrial sites, the amount of pollution that can come from car and bus and truck tailpipes, all sorts of protective standards. So I'm pleased to welcome to the conversation my colleague Noha Hagag, who is EDF's Senior Attorney for Clean Power. Noha, welcome.
Thank you so much, Jeremy.
Noha, we listed out some of the things that we're talking about here, the kinds of attacks that we're seeing from the Trump administration looking to roll back the protections that exist today against pollution. And I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about some of these standards that are at risk.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So as you summarized earlier, the Trump administration is proposing to roll back just a whole slew of protections, including GHG standards for power plants and vehicles, mercury and air toxic standards for coal, national standards for particulate matter, and much more. And these rollbacks will allow for a reckless build out of power sector plants and industrial sources, and an increase of greenhouse gases, smog, soot, and other cancer-causing air pollutants. Although many roles are under attack, I'd like to focus on two roles in particular.
Noha, I think I'm having some trouble hearing you. I'm not sure if that's true across the feeds, but
Hi, I cut out just a little bit there. Can folks still hear me?
Well, we can now. You're back.
Great. Thank you.
I lost you when you were just about to talk about a couple of standards in particular.
Amazing. So there are two standards, the GHG standards for power sector sources and the mercury and air toxic standards. So the GHG standards for power sector sources limit carbon dioxide from new gas plants and existing coal sources. And the EPA is proposing to repeal these standards based on two separate bases. One, that GHG pollution from the power sector does not significantly contribute to pollution that harms public health and welfare, which is just a crazy idea. And the second is that the standards are not achievable or too costly. EP's reasoning is not based on the factual analysis that the law requires. And the proposal noticeably lacks updated modeling and meaningful assessment of public health impacts, which vastly outweigh the cost of the rule. Separately, the mercury and air toxic standards, also referred to as METS, limit mercury and other cancer-causing pollutants from coal plants. The EPA is proposing to repeal the latest update to that rule, citing that the standards are not achievable and too costly. Again, EPA's reasoning is not based on the factual analysis that the law requires and puts the health of communities across the country at risk. EDF plans to rigorously advocate against those rollbacks and comments and in court to save those vital protections.
So we're gonna offer everyone on the call here an opportunity to take action on these particular rollbacks in just a few minutes. But we're talking about power plants, right? And power plants and the pollution that comes out of them, much of which can be controlled at the source. But what the Trump administration is saying is that they don't need to control it at the source. That's if I'm hearing you right. How will that impact our health and our future?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So the carbon standards will result in increases of greenhouse gases and other co-pollutants such as smog and soot. And this will result in worse climate impacts that we are increasingly feeling today and have been feeling for decades. And will also result in harms to public health, such as increases in heat stroke and respiratory illnesses caused by climate-induced heat and wildfires. The 2024 carbon standards were estimated to result in $370 billion in climate and public health benefits by 2047, which, by the way, again, vastly outweighed the cost of the rule. The mercury and air toxic standards will result in increases of toxic air pollution. So that includes mercury, arsenic, chromium, and nickel, and that can cause cancer, heart and lung diseases, and brain damage in children. And these standards were estimated to result in $420 million in health benefits by 2037. So really, these are vital protections that are just urgently needed.
And these proposals from the Trump administration, they're both moving forward right now and set to like move through their process in early August, so soon. And you've talked about both greenhouse gas emissions and a proposal around that, and a separate proposal around mercury and other air toxic pollutants. Can you tell us a little bit more about the difference between these things? Like, it's all like, in my mind, it's all pollution that comes from smokestacks, but they're different rules for different kinds of pollution.
Yes. So the primary differences between both of these rules is the sources that they protect emissions from, and then the actual pollutant. So the carbon standards in particular will cover just greenhouse gases, specifically carbon dioxide from gas-fired power plants and coal-fired power plants. And the mercury and air toxic standards will cover mercury and toxic air pollutants. So it's a separate regulation under the Clean Air Act from the 111 carbon standards that we just spoke about. And those will protect from pollution from coal plants in particular. So one impacts gas and coal, focuses on GHGs, and the other one impacts coal and focuses on mercury and other cancer-causing pollutants, and both at the source.
Excellent. So, I mean, not excellent that it's happening, but and so, we've really talked about NOAA two particular proposed rollbacks of pollution standards for power plants. But there are dozens more proposals, right? They're coming at everything that they can, and there's a lot more. We're talking about these two because they are currently accepting public comments about these two. But there's more about car pollution, other kinds of pollution from power plants, coal ash pollution that happens and gets into the groundwater. So lots of different things that they're talking about taking us backwards on.
Yes. So there are multiple different levers that the EPA is currently pulling on. And it's really interesting is that in all of these rules, they're not really accounting for the cumulative damage that's going to arise from all of these regulations being rolled back at once. So for example, GHG pollution from the power sector is the second largest source in the US of GHG pollution. And cars, trucks, and buses are the largest sector that emits GHG pollution in the US. But in the carbon standards, they're not really accounting for the fact that they're also rolling back all of these other regulations and pollutants and how that will cumulatively really impact and harm our public health.
And we've spent a lot of time talking about what they're trying to do in the Trump administration, and especially at the Environmental Protection Agency. We have a question from Roger in Illinois who asks sort of the flip side of that question. How do we stop the Trump appointees in the EPA from just sitting on their oars? How do we monitor their lack of action? So they're supposed to be enforcing stuff. Like, how do we make sure that they do that?
Yeah, so we use really every tool in our toolbox, and in the legal sense, that includes holding agencies accountable based on what is in the law, ensuring that we submit rigorous comments on rollbacks, and taking agencies to court to explain those decisions. So, for example, the Clean Air Act requires that EPA update certain source standards every 8 years. EDF previously sued EPA when it failed to update the nitrogen oxide standards within that 8-year timeframe. And now EPA, by court order, has to finalize those standards by this November 2025. Separately, comments are also extremely important. In comments, we have the opportunity to highlight the harmful impacts and deficiencies of those rulemakings, which serve as a basis for our fight in court. And the legal standard requires that EPA back its decision with a reasoned explanation based on facts. So EPA will have to answer to that in court, even if it fails to do so in a proposed rollback. So really just using every tool in our toolbox to hold EPA accountable and other agencies accountable as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for that incredible work. I know that it is not easy on a daily basis, and especially not these days, but thank you for everything that you're doing on behalf of EDF and our members nationwide, and all the people who stand to benefit from cleaner air, cleaner water. So thank you. NOAA will come back as a group for conversation in a bit. but I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about that third line of assault from the Trump administration, which is about the budget cuts and staffing cuts at the federal agencies that do so much important work that we care about. And that's a fight that is underway, has been since March with the first round of staffing cuts, but is only heating up right now as Congress begins its annual appropriations process. And appropriations is a very inside the beltway kind of word, but what this is this is the time of year, this is the work where Congress decides how to spend our tax dollars. Earlier this year, Congress passed a bill to keep the government funded and running through September 30th. But there's nothing on the horizon for what happens after September 30th. And that's where this budget process comes into play, where Congress, with the power of the purse, is supposed to pass the budgets to fund the government. And that happens through a whole series of what are called appropriations bills that fund the various federal agencies. And it all kicks off with the president's proposal. And President Trump proposed a budget that includes alarming cuts, slashing the Environmental Protection Agency's funding by more than 50%, and funding to the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, which includes the National Weather Service and other agencies that do great work around the environment, by more than 25%. Now it's up to Congress, the House of Representatives first, and then the Senate, to pass budgets using President Trump's request as a model. And that's what they're up to right now. Committees in the U.S. House of Representatives and in the U.S. Senate are beginning their work on budget writing for the next fiscal year that begins October 1st. And so far, what's been moving through Congress is maybe a little bit better, but not a lot better than what we saw from the president's proposal. But we know there's a real opportunity here, with some hardline Republicans likely to oppose any spending bills. We know that the 60-vote threshold in the Senate required to survive a filibuster means that bipartisan support will be essential to avoid a government shutdown. And that dynamic gives us a narrow but powerful chance to protect the work we care about. We'll need to make a strong case. Congress must fully fund the programs that safeguard public health, cut pollution, lower energy costs, and help communities prepare for disasters, not gut them. Next month, we'll host an event to break down what's at stake in this fight, how the process works, and what you can do to help protect the agencies and programs that keep our air and water clean and our communities safe. So this is a preview. We'll go deeper on this line of attack next month on August 19th. There's a link in the chat for the sign up on this, and we'll be excited to see you on August 19th to have a deep dive into the federal appropriations process and the cuts that members of Congress are trying to put through for the programs and issues that we care about. At this point, we're going to take an action break. It would not be an EDF action event if we didn't ask you to take action. So here we are. We're going to ask you to take action. Earlier, we discussed the efforts to roll back critical climate protections that are happening right now. Noha talked about this at length. The Environmental Protection Agency is seeking to roll back critical safeguards against mercury and air toxic pollution and climate pollution from power plants. These two separate rules are in conversation right now. The Environmental Protection Agency has asked for public comment, and that they're accepting public comments for another week or so. And so we have an opportunity to submit those public comments. So far, EDF members more than 8,000 EDF members have submitted comments to the Environmental Protection Agencies on each of these protective standards, urging that EPA maintain the standards and not roll them back. And we're asking you to take that action tonight. Please follow the link that's in the chat on wherever you're watching. If you're watching on YouTube or Facebook, follow the link and I can also read it out. It's edf.org/Z6RZ. And if you follow that link, you should be able to submit your comment on each of these protective standards for power plant pollution. So I urge you to do that. I'm going to give it just a minute for you to find that link, pull it up, and begin taking that action. And then we're going to come back in conversation with Emily and Noha and answer a few of the questions that have been put in the chat and a few more that we have pre-submitted. So thank you for taking action. Really appreciate it. Again, joining the more than 8,000 EDF members who have already taken action to submit comments to EPA. We urge you to do that right now. All right. Welcome back, Emily. Welcome back, Noha. I think we have a couple of questions that were submitted in advance, and I see a couple here that have been submitted in the chat while we've been in conversation. And I think there's one that came from somebody watching on YouTube that I'd love to ask the both of you, because it seems like the question, it's the question about hope, right? Like how do we get hope here? And the question is, if we vote for a climate or friendly president and Congress in 3.5 years, will it be possible to reverse all of these destructive actions that are happening through executive orders and budget cuts and regulatory rollbacks? What's our chance of clawing back some of the gains that we had and are losing now? Any thoughts?
Yeah. I mean, a couple of things I'm thinking about a lot. One is that even when federal action has been halted or slowed down, there's a lot of critical work being done at the state and local level and by other nations. And so I think it's important to remember that sort of progress is continuing to be made, even though we're experiencing a setback federally here. I also think there's a lot of commitment still from companies and corporations to continue to move forward with clean energy projects, despite the loss of federal tax incentives. So I think I don't want to gloss over the fact that I think it's significant, the scale of attacks, and that I think there will be damage done. But I do think it's not going to be too late. I think there's going to continue to be good work to be done. And it's why, engaging with good candidates for elected office is so important, and making sure that we're in a position to continue to advance the policies that we need to see.
Yeah, thank you so much, Emily. And to add to that, so, this isn't at least our first rodeo with the Trump administration. And in the 4 years that we had previously, we had put in just really amazing safeguards, and we have the procedural levers to do that again. So I am hopeful that we'll be able to put protections back in, especially with a more friendly administration.
Thanks, Noha. And I think, look, we're the Environmental Defense Fund, right? And we know we bring together science and law and economics, and we know that the science is on our side, the economics are on our side. Taking climate action is good. It matches the science, and it's good economics, and it's just the morally right thing to do, of course. So we're talking about real people and the lives and the harm that's going to happen. So I'm extremely hopeful that the actions we take will make a difference now, and we'll be able to to turn the tide in a couple of years with some great gains in elections. And to that point, because we're EDF Action, I can say that if you are an EDF Action member, we will be in touch about opportunities to make a difference in elections. So please make sure your membership is up to date. Take action on our website. Join us, and we'll be following up with not only the advocacy actions, but also actions you can take to support climate-friendly candidates. We have a question that was submitted from Mary in Indiana that's about changing attitudes over time. How do we do that? And I think that this is a tough thing to tackle. I mean, I think all the polling indicates that there's strong majorities of people who want to see climate action and who believe that the harm is real, and yet the government is going the other direction. So, what can we do to maintain strong public support in the face of these attacks and even strengthen that support over time? Do either of you have any thoughts on that? I know it's an out of the blue question. Sorry.
I think I honestly think it's so important to be able to talk about the impacts that we're all experiencing. I think, we've seen so many extreme weather events, even in the past few months, whether it's flooding or wildfires or extreme heat. I think we're all being impacted by these issues. And there's the impact from an extreme weather perspective, but there's also the pollution angle that Noha talks so much about. And then thinking about other sorts of costs that families will start to experience with rising energy prices and electricity bills. And I guess I just think the more that we are talking about those impacts and explaining that this isn't just a problem that's going to impact the future 50 years from now, that it's already being experienced now, I think that will help build that momentum and keep this as a priority for people.
Thanks. Yeah, I think conversation by conversation, right? With the conversations you have with your family, friends, and neighbors, and your members of Congress, it's all critically important, and this is how we'll continue to build the winning coalition and the winning campaign to really get at the emerging climate crisis. So, well, with that, I think we're pretty much at time. I want to thank Emily. Thank Noha for joining us and sharing your expertise with us. It's really helpful, and we know that EDF has great teams doing amazing work, and so thank you for representing here and being part of our conversation. We really appreciate it. And I want to thank everybody who joined us this evening from around the country, watching on YouTube or Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. Really appreciate you being here. And thank you for your support. Thank you for being members of EDF and EDF Action. We look forward to continuing the work to make a healthier, stronger communities. And there's lots to do. Look for our emails and our text messages and our phone calls. Every action matters, and we really appreciate it. Please submit your comments to the Environmental Protection Agency today. Those comment windows are closing soon, and we want to have a very strong showing of Americans who don't want to see these rollbacks. It's really important for the public record, and so thank you for taking that action. Thanks everybody for joining us. Have a great evening, and we'll see you again in August for our deeper conversation on the proposed cuts to federal staff and budgets. Have a great night.
Yeah.